So I've been asked if I can put together a little Octane tutorial. Now, I'm not as familiar with Octane as I am with Bryce or Wings 3D, so there are areas where I will probably go wrong. However, what I'm just going to do is try and build a scene, and it'll work, hopefully, even if I'm not doing it in the best way possible. So as things start out, you end up with this empty node diagram down here, and you've got this preview configuration, but you're not getting anything in your render area here because there's nothing to render. You don't have an empty scene, you just have nothing when you set out. So what I'm going to do is go to Node, and I need to import an object. So I'll import something I've prepared already. So this is this my little object from the Funky Metals and Shapes product that Haro and I have made. And if I now select that, and when it's highlighted, you get a preview of it as a result of these settings here. So I think one's the material setting, and one's the object that you've got selected, and one's the main scene. As things stand, this is being rendered through the configuration, the preview configuration thing block here. What we're seeing here is whatever that's set to, and this has got its own little collection of things associated with it. If you double click on this, you can access that and it becomes another tab. So this is actually showing you how you can set things up. It's not you can pick these blocks up and slide them around so you can see what it's composed of, and this is essentially what we're going to build in the other tab here, the project tab. So this is the preview. Now, one tip I have had, and it's worth noting, so this is the progress, and this is the graphics card just sampling and sampling and sampling. So if you don't want your graphics card to be continually thrashed to death by this process, you can select the mesh preview kernel. That's the thing doing the rendering here, and if you look in here, there's this max samples, and if you turn that down like to 100, then it'll just stop when it reaches 100. So that stops the graphics card from just continually running while you're setting scenes up in Octane. So let's get back to our scene. So here we've got this object, and what I'm going to do now is disable the enable disable button here from previewing. So I'm only going to view this through the render target that I'm going to put in. So it'll stop. Well, I'll show you what happens, and then you'll see why I want to turn it off. So I'll go add node and put in my render target, and that's got all these little plugins here for the pin connections for the various things you need to plug into it, and the color coded so it helps you know which one can connect to what. And at the moment that's the mesh input. So if I take my mesh output, feed it into the render target, you can see how when switching between these two, okay, means you're getting different camera views, because we've got a camera associated with this render target. Even though it's not plugged in, there's all settings for it. There's the default settings on the right hand side of each of those pins. So, but I'm going to plug individual ones in because it'll make it a lot clearer what's going on. So when you're switching between these two, when you got on this one, it's viewing it through the viewing of the mesh, and you switch this one, that gets a bit confusing. So what I'm going to do is disable those by just clicking on them, and then when I click on the render target and the mesh, it won't switch back to it. Likewise, if I just add a node and put a material in, let's put a diffuse material in and plug it into the material slot there, you can see that changes colour. If I enable that little control there, when I click on the material it goes into this preview area. Use the left mouse button there to rotate this view and scroll wheel. So this is another preview that's available that comes in automatically, but it just gets a bit annoying when you're clicking on everything. It keeps swapping backwards and forwards, so I can just disable that. So that's my tip for doing that. Right, so this object currently has no context. So I'm going to introduce another object, and then allow me to show you another one of these control blocks that you get. So if I go node import wavefront object, and it'll also show you a real limitation that I feel that Octane has that I don't know how to overcome yet. So here I've got my base object, which is just a ground shape that's been exported from Wings 3D. Both these objects, by the way, have been UV mapped. UV mapping of the objects is really quite critical for applying anything other than the most basic materials. Otherwise like does Studio, for example. If it doesn't have a UV map associated with it, it can't appropriately apply image textures. It can do its own procedural textures, but it hasn't got the fancy advanced mapping modes that, for example, Bryce has, that allows it to handle image textures without the need of a UV map. So if I want to put this object on my base, I need to add a node. I need to add a geometry node that allows me to have a geometry group. So this has 2 inputs and 1 output, so I can feed the output into the render target and then feed both these in. So I've got both those in there now. They're both in the default grey material, and you can see my objects buried into the ground. So I need to find some way of moving the ground down, and this is done with another block. So this one's a geometry block that is called placement, and this is a control. So if I put that in there and then put that there so that the base goes through the placement, I can now modify the Y value, so I can translate it. But what I've found is that the rotation and translation, and it gets a bit lost because of the position of the origins, and this control is very sensitive. So oops, the ground's gone too far away. So what I tend to find I'm doing is having to enter the figures in and then just a bit at a time work out how to get this position. So you see now it's hovering off the ground, so I'll try -3, and that's more or less on the ground. Now the scale here is in X, Y and Z, but you can just, I think this, not that one, that one there, you can just turn it to 1 so all 3 get modified at once, which is useful to know. And then when you shrink it down, you can see because of the offset, as it shrinks it's actually approaching the world center in some way. So if you want to get very exact placement on the ground, sometimes you can do it by roughly setting the y-axis and then adjusting the scale. In this case, I mean, it'll probably turn out to be different for different things. So if this is more or less square and I wanted to change the document aspect ratio in the render target, okay, down here, and I think it's on this yellow blob. So if we look on the right hand side here, we've got this resolution setting, so you can enter that figure there. Or something I like to do, right, this is another way of viewing this network of bits. So this is like a hierarchy. So if I click on that plus, you'll see there's resolution just there, and that corresponds to that yellow blob there, which corresponds to this little block here. So if I right click on that and copy, and then right click here and paste, I can actually bring that in as a block on its own and then plug it in here. And that means that if I want to find the resolution quickly, I can just click on this block here, and then I can enter it up here. So I'll go 512, 512, and so I've made that square. Other things that I might want separate, well, you see there's a camera one. So if I add node and then choose camera, I've got the choice of panoramic or thin lens. So I'm going to choose thin lens, and then you see it's turquoise, I can plug it into the render target. So you can see now I've done that, it's repositioned itself. So I'll just go back to where I was, and then I can modify my field of view, for example, down a bit for still life appropriate. Also, all these windows are scalable, which is very nice. So I could just have a bit more information in. You'll see that the sliders adjust according to how much space they've got, which is it's a very good interface on Octane, I think, apart from the limitation with placement that gets on my wicks. But okay, what else are we going to need? Well, this blob here is environment, that's your lighting. So likewise, you can add this as a node, go to environments. I'm going to use daylight. Texture environment can get a bit complicated, but it can sort of handle HDRI lighting, but I've not really got fully to grips with that, so I'll stick with this daylight one. So you just take that out and drag it and plug it in there, and you've got your daylight, and then you've got this little map here that allows you to position your sunlight. It's good lighting. Not that keen on the way that this works. It's okay, but sometimes it's a bit hard to work out where you put in the sun. I rather prefer the Bryce rollerball method when you've got everything aligned, but you know, maybe it's just because I'm not really used to it. The other thing is that this lighting model here, that I think the new one is better. You get better light quality out of the sky. Just thought I'd mention that. Okay, right. So what other blobs we've got here? Okay, this is imager is a good one. You can modify things on the imager and it can still continue rendering. So when you're doing your final rendering, things like the imager and the post-processing you can continue to work with. If you're doing your final rendering, remember to use this locking thing as well, so you don't accidentally modify your view. Otherwise it'll start from scratch. Even if you just tweak it slightly, it goes back and starts rendering again. So I'm going to put in the imager. There we go. It's only got one imager to choose from. Make sure you plug that into the block there, and the kind of things you've got on that is exposure, f-stop, gamma correction, and this is a weird one. I'll point this one out. Hot pixel removal. So if you've got a lot of fireflies, you actually, to get rid of them, it does more filtering when you set this down to 0, which seems to be the opposite effect to what you'd expect, though you might notice the image goes a bit soft if it's set that low, and then when it's up at the top there you don't get any firefly removal. White balance, that's quite handy too. Okay, I mentioned the post-processing. I'm going to throw that in now. Notice when you put post-processing in, for example, it comes in automatically disabled. You need to enable it, and then you can set your glare power, and that's like a starburst effect. So if you've got some highlights in, we might look at that in a minute. Bloom power, I think you'd be fairly aware what these settings are if you've used any paint packages, as it's quite similar to the effects you can get in paint packages. I think probably if it'll be disabled by default, because when it's enabled with every render cycle it probably has to reapply this, so it'll be eating processing power, though in this case with it being a GPU renderer the impact on it seems to be less visible than it would be if it was CPU rendering. So I think the graphics card I've got, this GTX 660, it's got something like 940 and 960, I can't exactly remember, virtual cores working, whereas the processor's only got about 4 real and 4 8. No, not virtual cores, the actual cores, aren't they? On the I'm digressing. That's not really relevant to what I'm talking about. So anyway, this brown blob is probably the most interesting blob of all, because this allows you to plug in your render kernels. Now you've got direct lighting, which is very straightforward and fast, and is what's set in the preview mode, but that does have more sophisticated GI modes. So you have this diffuse mode, which is more like the pathfinding mode later on. I don't really know how these work. This is getting into the area of where I'm not really very familiar with, but I know that this diffuse setting is more sophisticated than this ambient occlusion setting, for example, and there are other settings as well. You just have to play with those, because I've not really looked at that. What I have sort of used quite a bit is this path tracing one and this PMC one. Now the path tracing one is a bit like transient rendering in Bryce, and again, when you set these up you need to be aware of the max samples. So I set it down for previewing and then set it right up for final rendering. And also PMC seems to involve an additional level of filtering, so if you've got an image that's producing a lot of fireflies, then that helps reduce the fireflies. Well, that's the impression I've got. Oh, and there is a further kernel, I'll show you that there, which is this deep channel kernel, which allows you to capture things like the normals and Z depth, you know, like altitude masking kind of thing. So in things you could extract filters from. So that's worth looking at if you're looking to generate effects and wireframe modes and that. So some cool effects you get out of that, but probably a bit beyond the scope of what I'm hoping is a fairly basic overall guide to putting a quick render together in Octane. So time marches on. Let's consider the situation here. So I've turned that down a bit. Let's have a look at the materials. Well, if you have got objects here that have UV maps with them, then there is this live database, which is quite handy, and you've got materials that have already been made. So some of them though you can't seem to find them in here. So some of them don't open up, and sometimes they do. I don't know if they've not been populated perhaps, or this needs somehow cleaning up, but there are plenty. So here, if you can just, there you go, we got a preview. So if you wanted this amethyst stone, for example, you could just it is drag and drop, yeah, drag and drop it into there. You see it load up in the corner there, and then you can take your existing one and plug in your new one. So, and as a result of the UV map on there, that gives you the image. Now if I need to increase the frequency of that, some of the pre-made materials. You see, this is oh, what's the right word? Hang on, a macro, right? So if I double click on this, you can see what's actually inside this. So it's got an output. You can add these as nodes as well, so you can make your own macros. It's got an output, and then it's got this glossy material plugged into it. Sometimes they're made of far more sophisticated materials. So if I wanted to modify this so the material surface was of a higher frequency, we can look, as I will show you the texture thing that it's coming from. And if, for example, if it's got a bump pattern associated with it, I can't see very much there, but it must have, then you'd want that to be at the same frequency set as that if you were going to scale it. So they've got the same scale. So you could extract the scale number. So if I could do 6 there, that's increased the frequency of the diffuse channel, and 6 there increases the frequency of the bump to match. Or you can do crafty things, like if we go back into here, I could just copy that. And go back to my project and paste it there, so I could work on it in my main view. Then it appears in my little breakdown of what's in here. I could copy the diffuse component and plug that back into diffuse, and then I could get the bump component and copy that and paste that back and put it back into bump. And then these components, I could get hold of the scale and copy that from one of these and paste that. I can just slide this around with the right click and drag, find out where scale gets plugged in, and plug the same scale into both of them, in which case, if I've got everything working right, where's my image got to? Why can't I see that? I must have slipped up. Oh, I've unplugged that. There, plug that back in. Okay, right. If I get my scale now, I can now slide the scale up and down for that material together. So that's one way of manipulating the materials a bit. I suppose I shouldn't go too heavily into manipulating materials. And you can see there's a few fireflies turning up because of the glossiness of this material and the intensity of the light source. So if I thought that was going to be a problem, I'll right click, add node, kernel, and choose PMC, plug that one in instead. You can keep these lingering around if you want to try different things, and you can have multiple cameras just by copying this component. So there is that. Material can be plugged in likewise for this base, or even if you don't want to do that, you can just modify it directly. So if I wanted to change the base color, I could just do it directly in here. I don't have to add a node to do that. That's optional. It just makes it easier when you've added the nodes, because you can do tricks like this where things are interdependent. You could just start plugging more things in. Right, I suppose, let's see how this glossy material, we can increase its index and it'll make it shiny. If I've managed to find it right. Have we got the index there? Has that worked? Usually it makes it shinier. I might have missed something there. Possibly whatever some of the other settings are. See, specular setting. There you go. Turn the specular setting up. So probably if you used any other rendering software, you'd be familiar with a lot of these settings anyway. So, and this is nice, the roughness. So it shows you how powerful this render engine is in Octane. If you set the roughness right up, it turns glossy material into a diffuse one. Though there are separate diffuse options. You have in the materials, I'll just show you this, you've got specular, glossy and diffuse, and they all have different inputs. So I'll switch it over to specular. I'll show you how fast this specular renders, I should say. Okay, it's nice and fast. Other things that you find in Octane are things like the subsurface scattering, like that too, and that's on both on specular and on diffuse. So I'll just do a quick subsurface scattering setup since it's fairly easy to set up. I'll change this one. I'll make that one glossy, so I'll just set that to default glossy. There we go. Right, so this diffuse material with the sun behind it makes it a good candidate for subsurface scattering. What you need is a transmission node, so you click on the node and go float texture and then increase that so you've got full transmission. We'll keep things simple and get rid of the diffuse. So now we're transmitting and we've got no diffuse, so this is just what's coming through the material now. So I suppose it's like paper at the moment. If I add a node, medium, and choose scattering, that has a specific place to be plugged in just there. So there's my medium. Now I can set my scattering value up So that's scattering it a bit. And then I choose here, I can say have RGB spectrum, and then I can absorb, say, tiny bit of green and a tiny bit of blue, which will make this, depending how much of each is absorbed, it'll change the colour of it. So if I absorb equal amounts of blue or green, we'll get sort of an orangey colour here, or a bit more blue absorbed there, but never mind. And then the two controls that really affect the scattering here is the amount of scattering within the surface. I've not really got to grips with what the phase effect has with the scattering, but you can see it changes things. But most critically, because this will be affected by the size of your model, is the scale. So as you take the scale down, it'll tend to become more transparent, and you take it right up, it'll tend to look a lot more solid. The default setting is 100. So if you wanted that to look like a plastic material, probably a good bet would be to incorporate it with a glossy material as well, because it's just diffuse at the moment. Plastics tend to be a bit glossy. Oh, and it'll allow me to show you the material mixer. So I'll add node and material mix. So here we've got two material inputs. So if I just pop this one up here, take that one down there, put the material mix in there, put that in there, I have got on the material mix block here this amount which controls how much each channel influences it. So if I turn this all the way down to 0, it switches to the right hand channel, and if I turn it all the way up to 1, it's switching to the left hand channel, which is a bit contrary to the way that slides, but never mind. So I could prepare here, I'll use this to preview my next material. I'll add node and bring in a glossy material like so, plug that in to one side of this, make it very reflective. I'll get rid of the diffuse, so we've just got this, looks like a mirror. I think if it's down at 1, it's a mirrored surface as well. So this is really shiny, and if I turn the roughness down, it'll have a very sharp highlight on it. And then what I can do here is use the mixer now and just mix a little bit of that with my diffuse component there, so it's adding a bit of shine to the surface. So that's a way of building up a little bit more complicated material there. So you see this highlight here, that's coming as a result of the glossy material. I've need quite a lot of samples because of what I'm using. I'm using PMC, so that would take a while to render to get rid of all the noise, but over time it gradually improves, and that would be, you know, the finished render, I suppose. So as I was saying, lock this off if this is going to be where I'm going to stop, or change the resolution if that's the case, and then you can still play without it resetting the sampling with the gamma, for example. So I could turn this gamma up or down, like increase the contrast, or reduce the exposure, or add this vignetting effect around the outside. And as well, you can click on the post-processing, then you can put in these other effects. They only seem to kick in about 10 really, so if there are some areas where you can get a good highlight, then you can use the glare power, and there's other it's fairly obvious what those controls do really. You just play with them, and because everything previews so quickly in Octane, it makes it a lot easier to figure out what control does what. It's not like a case of waiting for the rendering to see whether you've set something right. You see it fairly soon. If things get really sluggish, there's a control here that allows you to change the subsampling level for when you're rotating the scene around and that kind of thing. Okay, right, well, yes, I feel like I've gone on a lot and rambled, but there you go. I'll let this render out with the image for the video, and I hope you found that useful and that you'll be able to follow some of that. Anyway, feedback is welcome. That's the end of the video. Well, I'm going to contradict myself now, because it's not the end of the video, because I forgot something that I really should have mentioned when bringing in the objects, because it was something that caught me out early on. When you bring in one of these objects, right, like this, which was a Wavefront object, it comes in already smoothed on its material. So when you make these materials, you've got to check this smoothing setting, because it does tend to already be smoothed. So when the object comes in, it's already smoothed, and when you add materials to them, they're already smooth. So like this ground surface here, if we look at the glossy material, it'll be set as smooth, and that'll affect on a flat surface like this ground the way that the reflections are interpreted. So if you've got an object with straight flat sides, remember to uncheck smoothing. What'll happen now though is if I uncheck this, it'll have to restart rendering again. So even one small change like that, it's going to affect it because it changes the properties of how things reflect off the surface. So starting from scratch. Right then, that really is the end of the video.